We are all aware of the ongoing culture war, a battle between the conservative right and the woke left. And I'll get into the nuances of these ideologies later. But what we're going to answer in detail in this video is the following questions. What is the fundamental flaw with woke philosophy? Why is it so pervasive? And how do we stop it? I will preface this. I do think that the woke ideology is toxic. I do find it counterproductive and counterintuitive to a thriving society. So if that offends you, I still invite you to stay. With that, let's answer the first question. What is the fundamental flaw with wokeism? The best analogy I can draw to make the point that I'm about to make is with the issue of transgenderism. Transgenderism is not a real anthropology. It can't be sustained at a large scale, and more so in its logical conclusion could only lead to a sizable proportion of the population being out of tune with their natural assigned gender roles. And what I mean by that is the first thing we identify in our children isn't even their name, it's their sex or gender. And that's important to know because it gives people a sense of the type of responsibility they will ultimately partake on. That is the responsibility of living in the world as a girl or a boy, a man or a woman. We treat males and females differently because they are inherently different. However, within the transgender ideology, here's what we have. We have transgender, which is someone whose sex is different than the one assigned at birth. But the etymology of the prefix trans literally means to go beyond or transcend, aka transcend gender, which simply isn't real. Then we have intersex. Intersex is a grouping of people or just a person with a genetic anomaly that doesn't fit the gender binary, which is interesting because it implies there's a gender binary, but it's also acknowledged as the scientific anomaly that it is. It's not an identity, it's something you're born with. Then there's agender, which means not having a gender. There's pangender, which is all genders. Gender fluid, which means gender changing over time or changing whenever one wants. Then there's bigender and trigender, which means you are two genders in one or three genders in one, respectively. And there's probably more, but that has to manage to exist as equal in truth to what we would call normal. But the transgender ideology calls it cisgender, which is the gender you identify as being the one you're born with. Do you see the problem here? The problem is that only so many of these things can be true at once without contradicting each other. How can, in human nature, agender, which is no gender, and pangender, which is all genders, simultaneously exist? How can gender fluid, which is the fluidity of gender, and intersex, which is a genetic anomaly you're born with, also be true? Well, the answer to that is that it's based in how you feel. Now, I will concede to this. Intersex is shown by the National Institute of Medicine as 1.7% of the population, but that's because it's something that can be biologically proven. It's something that's real and that people are born with, but the rest, it's not so much. Because if the proposition of how you feel is the grounds for your true spiritual identity, then that means truth is at the discretion of how you feel. And truth and spirituality cannot be reduced to how one feels. Nonetheless, if you follow this ideology, that means you probably believe that truth is relative, which is exactly what woke philosophy gets wrong. This is the fundamental problem woke philosophy poses on its followers, the idea that truth is relative. Truth is not relative, it's objective. Just as the rate of gravity is 9.8 meters per second, just as the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning, there are only two genders, men and women, male and female. What about intersex? Well, intersex in and of itself is not a gender. It's a genetic predisposition. It's just simply a matter of your body and your genetics not allowing you to conform to be completely male and female. If you don't believe me, just ask the Intersex Society of North America. Intersex is not a gender. This has nothing to do with how you feel. However, the existence of these anomalies is a terrible baseline for an entire ideology, which is based on identifying by way of feeling. In other words, if we're going to dismantle the falsity of the woke philosophy, we have to acknowledge that truth is not a relative feeling, it's an objective fact. Now, question number 2, why is it so pervasive? Well, that one is simple. It's because people want to be seen as good, and woke philosophy allows people to feel as if they are being good. But in our good intentions, we may be prone to causing more harm than good. The clearest and most evident example of this is in the case of the abortion argument. Yes, we have to go there. There are two camps, pro-life and pro-choice. Pro-choice says the rights of women come first, and pro-life says that the right of the unborn child come first. Now, here's where you'll probably get mad at me and click away, but just bear with me. The pro-choice movement says that we have compassion for the woman, but the pro-life movement says we have compassion for the unborn child. Both are equally valid. However, according to a reference article from Princeton University and a separate article from Diane Irving, which I will link down in the description below, they all agree that life begins at conception. In fact, a study done by Stephen Jacobs at the University of Chicago, about 95% of over 5,000 biologists agree that life begins at fertilization. In fact, they went deeper. They asked specifically pro-choice biologists when life begins, and 60% of pro-choice biologists agree that life begins at conception. Nonetheless, the question isn't when life begins when it comes to the abortion argument. It comes to the scientifically proven and agreed upon notion that life does in fact begin at conception. Therefore, the question you probably actually want to ask is, when should legal consideration begin? But we do have to agree, in tangent to what the biologists say, that life begins at conception. However, back to the question, why is woke philosophy so pervasive? Like I said, it's because people want to be seen as good. But the pro-life camp does have to see where pro-choice comes from in their concern for women. But the pro-choice does have to concede to the fact that life begins at conception. And it is with sincere contemplation that it's only inevitable that one concludes that one's right to life is the foundation of all other rights. And I won't get into the nuances of it all right now, but both sides are fighting for what they believe is good and compassionate, but only one can be objectively true. But that leads us to the final question. How do we stop it? Well, we stop it by agreeing on things that can be agreed upon. Transgenderism as an ideology cannot exist in tangent as objective truth alongside the normative cisgender predisposition we are born into. And you might ask, well, why not just leave the trans ideology alone? Well, that's because the abnormal nature of the ideology is such that it must be spread in order for it to be seen as normal, and it shouldn't be. Which is what the entire movement of wokeism is trying to do right now. Abortion cannot be fought on the premise that we are confused about when life begins, because we know when it begins. Objective truth is clear. It begins at conception. The nuances of legal consideration can be discussed further in a debate or a conversation, but this much is true. Life begins at conception. And I will say that the woke ideology is a philosophy of good intentions, but heed this warning. Not all good intentions lead to good, just, and moral outcomes. Now, if you like what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button so you can learn all the ways to develop a philosophy for a better life. When you subscribe to Better Happens Daily, you are saying to yourself, life can only get better from here. Remember, truth is not a relative feeling. It is an objective fact. Now, may God bless you and get out there and make better happen daily.